Antebellum is an upcoming American horror film written and directed by Gerard and Christopher Renz. The film stars Janelle Monáe, Marque Richardson, Lange, Huston, Kiersey Clemons, Tongayi Chirisa, Gabourey Sidibe, Robert Aramayo, Cowles, and Jena Malone. Antebellum is scheduled for release in the United States on August 21, 2020. Its release was delayed from an original April 2020 date due to the COVID-19 pandemic. With anti-police brutality protests marching across the nation, anti-racist books selling out, Confederate statues toppling from their pedestals, and NASCAR banning the Confederate flag from its events, we're watching a moment of reckoning with our country's history happening right before our eyes. Many people are looking back at our past behavior and current interactions with a more critical eye as we do the necessary and important work of dismantling internalized racism. This week, the Grammy Award-winning country trio formerly known as Lady Antebellum announced that it will change its name to Ladia, after reflecting on its own complicity. That makes us all reflect on what the term really means. The name originally referred to architecture. In a letter to fans, the band expressed regret for not changing the name sooner, writing, "Our hearts have been stirred with conviction, our eyes opened wide to the injustices, inequality and biases Black women and men have always faced and continue to face every day," it said. Blind spots we didn't even know existed have been revealed. Musicians Charles Kelly, Hillary Scott, and Dave Haywood got the inspiration from the Antebellum style home where they took their first photos, when they first formed in 2006. "We were taking pictures outside an Antebellum home in Nashville and we were searching for a name," Kelly said, in an interview with the Cheyenne Post last year. "We were going to call ourselves something like Springdale, or something, but names are so hard to come up with. I was like, man, that's a beautiful Antebellum house, and that's cool, maybe there's a haunted ghost or something in there like Lady Antebellum." We all thought it sounded cool, like Southern rock. What the word antebellum means today. The dictionary definition of antebellum literally means before the war, coming from the Latin phrase, antebellum. It became widely associated with the U.S. Civil War after it was over, and now calls to mind grand plantation-style architecture with stately columns, sprawling grounds, trees draped in Spanish moss, and women in hoop skirts fainting on the porch along with the wind. But the key word here is plantation. That's the major problem with the antebellum aesthetic. It was built on the backs of slave labor. While the original term wasn't offensive, antebellum, as we use it today, glorifies a painful period in our history when Black people were enslaved by white people. It's important to remember that architecture, fashion, and even language don't live in a vacuum. They're contextual and evolve along with our society. Elements of our past we may have thought acceptable or even romanticized at one time have been revealed as problematic today. That includes the term antebellum. We can all keep learning. We are regretful and embarrassed to say that we did not take into account the associations that weigh down this word, referring to the period of history before the Civil War, which includes slavery. Ladia wrote of the band's blind spots at the time. Like them, more and more of us are opening our eyes to racist elements of our world we haven't examined in that light before. It's a difficult education, and one we're all taking at different speeds. And while Ladia said it couldn't excuse its short-sighted choice of names at the time, the bandmates committed to doing the work to become better anti-racists and educate themselves. As part of that, the band plans to start with a donation to the Equal Justice Initiative, a non-profit that provides legal representation to prisoners through Aid, the band's philanthropic effort. As a band, we have strived for our music to be a refuge, inclusive of all. We've watched and listened more than ever these last few weeks, and our hearts have been stirred with conviction, our eyes opened wide to the injustices, inequality and biases Black women and men have always faced and continue to face every day. Now, blind spots we didn't even know existed have been revealed. After much personal reflection, band discussion, prayer and many honest conversations with some of our closest Black friends and colleagues, we have decided to drop the word Antebellum from our name and move forward as Lady A, the nickname our fans gave us almost from the start. When we set out together almost 14 years ago, we named our band after the Southern Antebellum style home where we took our first photos. As musicians, it reminded us of all the music born in the South that influenced us. Southern rock, blues, R&B, gospel and of course country. But we are regretful and embarrassed to say that we did not take into account the associations that weigh down this word referring to the period of history before the Civil War, which includes slavery. We are deeply sorry for the hurt this has caused and for anyone who has felt unsafe, unseen or unvalued. Causing pain was never our heart's intention, but it doesn't change the fact that indeed, it did just that. So today, we speak up and make a change. We hope you will dig in and join us. We understand that many of you may ask the question, why have you not made this change until now? The answer is that we can make no excuse for our lateness to this realization. What we can do is acknowledge it, turn from it and take action. We feel like we have been awakened, but this is just one step. There are countless more that need to be taken. We want to do better. We are committed to examining our individual and collective impact and making the necessary changes to practice anti-racism. We will continue to educate ourselves, have hard conversations, and search the parts of our hearts that need pruning, to grow into better humans, better neighbors. Our next outward step will be a donation to the Equal Justice Initiative through Aid. Our prayer is that if we lead by example, with humility, love, empathy and action, we can be better allies to those suffering from spoken and unspoken injustices, while influencing our children and generations to come. Lady A is a country music trio who have become more and more famous in its 14 years of performing. However, the band has been known up until now as Lady Antebellum, with the name change announced only recently. Many have been curious as to know what the word antebellum means, and why it has caused such controversy. During this time, the rise of the anti-slavery movement and abolitionists caused civil unrest in the country, with the South being greatly in favor of slavery due to the way in which it helped grow their economy. The band, now known as Lady A, however, spoke of how they chose this word for their band name after doing a photo shoot in historical costumes at antebellum houses, which spoke of a particular time in history which many would wish to forget. The band released a statement, which reads, "As musicians, it reminded us of all the music born in the South that influenced us. But we are regretful and embarrassed to say that we did not take into account the associations that weigh down this word referring to the period of history before the Civil War, which includes slavery. We are deeply sorry for the hurt this has caused and for anyone who has felt unsafe, unseen or unvalued. Causing pain was never our heart's intention, but it doesn't change the fact that indeed, it did just that." Ladia is a nickname the band's fans have given it for many years, so they felt this was a more appropriate new name. The band explained in its statement, posted to Twitter, "We've watched and listened more than ever over these last few weeks, and our hearts have been stirred with conviction, our eyes opened wide to the injustices, inequality and biases Black women and men have always faced and continue to face every day. Now, blind spots we didn't even know existed have been." Lady added, "We can make no excuse for our lateness to this realization. What we can do is acknowledge it, turn from it and take action." Ladia is not the first music group or label to change its name in the wake of the Black Lives Matter protests. British record label One Little Indian Records, which has released music by Björk, Sigur Rós and Paul McCartney, changed its name to One Little Independent. It was founded and is managed by punk rock bassist Derek Burkett of former UK punk band Flux of Pink Indians. He wrote in a statement, following the receipt of an eye-opening letter from a crass fan that detailed precisely why the logo and label name are offensive, as well as the violent history of the terminology. "I felt equally appalled and grateful to them for making me understand what must be changed." He went on to explain that the label had been founded when his friends were inspired by the philosophies of the indigenous people of the Americas, adding, "I was naive enough at the time of founding my label to think that the name and logo was reflective of my respect and appreciation of the culture. I recognize now that both contribute to racism and should have been addressed a long time ago." Along with his admission, the Grammy Awards, as well as label Republic Records, which releases music by singer Ariana Grande, have dropped the use of the word urban in their music categories. Tyler, the creator, a Grammy winner, said of the term in January, "I don't like that urban word, it's just a politically correct way to say the N-word to me. Why can't we just be in pop?" The move is a vote of confidence that moviegoing in the US will be back in full swing by the late summer. Antebellum had originally been set to debut on April 24, but was pulled in mid-March amid concerns about the pandemic. In the wake of the global health crisis, the studio also previously postponed Chris Rock and Samuel L. Jackson's Saw reboot and Sarah Paulson's Run. Monáe portrays a modern-day author transported back into the 19th century as a slave in the southern United States to come face-to-face with her ancestors. The trailer's tagline asks, "What if fate chose you to save us from our past?" Antebellum is directed by Gerard Bush and Christopher Renz, also known as the team of Bush and Renz. Monáe's co-stars include Marque Richardson II, Eric Lange, Jack Huston, Kiersey Clemons, Tongayi Chirisa, Gabourey Sidibe, Rob Aramayo, Lily Cowles and Jena Malone. Bush and Renz also produced the film with Raymond Mansfield, Sean McKittrick, Zev Foreman and Leslie Wills. Lionsgate also announced that it has signed a deal for the upcoming Bush and Renz horror project Rapture after winning a bidding war for the duo's short story in which a family is torn apart by warring beliefs and must come together to unravel the mystery around the sudden vanishing of the global population. Bush and Renz will write the screenplay, direct it and produce it, reteaming with McKittrick and Mansfield. Foreman will serve as executive producer with Ted Hamm. Maya Rodrigo will co-produce, Jim Miller and Aaron Edmonds will oversee the project for Lionsgate. Successful author Veronica Henley, Janelle Monáe, finds herself trapped in a horrifying reality and must uncover the mind-bending mystery before it's too late. Antebellum is a terrifying new thriller from the producer of the acclaimed films Get Out and Us. and groundbreaking directors Gerard Bush and Christopher Renz. Bush plus Renz, an exciting new voice in filmmaking. Antebellum period facts, information and articles about the antebellum period, before the Civil War. Antebellum period summary. The antebellum period in American history is generally considered to be the period before the Civil War and after the War of 1812. Although some historians expand it to all the years from the adoption of the Constitution in 1789 to the beginning of the Civil War. It was characterized by the rise of abolition and the gradual polarization of the country between abolitionists and supporters of slavery. During this same time, the country's economy began shifting in the North to manufacturing as the Industrial Revolution began, while in the South, a cotton boom made plantations the center of the economy. The annexation of new territory and Western expansion saw the reinforcement of American individualism and of manifest destiny. The idea that Americans and the institutions of the U.S. are morally superior and Americans are morally obligated to spread these institutions. The cotton economy in the South. In the South, cotton plantations were very profitable, at least until overplanting leached most of the nutrients from the soil. Advances in processing the fiber, from Eli Whitney's cotton gin to the development of power looms and the sewing machine, increased demand for cotton to export from the South to England and the mills of New England. Plantation owners were able to obtain large tracts of land for little money, particularly after the Indian Removal Act was passed in 1830. These plantations depended on a large force of slave labor to cultivate and harvest the crop. Most white farmers in the 19th century wanted and were able to obtain their own farms as the U.S. expanded south and west, and slaves not only provided a labor source that couldn't resign or demand higher wages, their progeny ensured that labor source would continue for generations. The demand for slave labor and the U.S. ban on importing more slaves from Africa drove up prices for slaves, making it profitable for smaller farmers in older settled areas such as Virginia to sell their slaves further south and west. Most farmers in the South had small to medium-sized farms with few slaves, but the large plantation owners' wealth, often reflected in the number of slaves they owned, afforded them considerable prestige and political power. As the quality of land decreased from overcultivation, slave owners increasingly found that the majority of their wealth existed in the form of their slaves. They began looking to new lands in Texas and further west, as well as in the Caribbean and Central America, as places where they might expand their holdings and continue their way of life. Early industrialization and the rise in manufacturing in the North. The early Industrial Revolution began with textile industry in New England, which was revolutionized by Samuel Slater. Slater was a former apprentice in one of Britain's largest textile factories who emigrated to Rhode Island after learning that American states were paying bounties to people who could help replicate British textile machines, such as the spinning jenny, although the British government forbade the export of the machines or emigration of people with knowledge of them. In 1787, the horse-powered Beverly Cotton Manufactory had begun operating in Beverly, Massachusetts. In 1793, Slater opened the first fully mechanized mill in Pawtucket, Rhode Island. His system of independent mills and mill towns spread through the Blackstone Valley into Massachusetts. In the 1820s, Slater's system was supplanted by the more efficient Waltham or Lowell system. The Waltham system included power looms in the mill, rather than Slater's practice of having weaving done at local farms. The Waltham system also included specialized, trained employees to run the looms, mainly young women, giving rise to the concept of wage labor, which gradually began overtaking previous forms of labor, such as apprenticeship and indentured servitude, family labor, and slavery in industrialized areas. A population shift from farms to cities had already begun, but the promise of better income in factory jobs accelerated that movement. Manufacturing advances were not limited to the textile industry alone. Similar advances occurred in other industries, including the manufacture of equipment, machinery, furniture, paints, paper, and glass. Every part of American industry and production was affected. Penny press and affordable newspapers. Among the areas benefiting from advances in technology was the printing business, in particular, the printing of newspapers. Most newspapers in the early 19th century cost 6 cents a copy and were affordable only to the upper classes, though a barter system often allowed readers to trade rags, whiskey or other goods for a subscription. Presses were still hand-powered and essentially unchanged from Gutenberg's design until 1810, when German printer Friedrich Koenig patented the steam-powered press. In 1843, American Richard M. Hull made a further improvement with the rotary printing press, which arranged the material to be printed on a cylinder rather than a flat plate, allowing a much larger volumes of material to be printed, millions of copies in a day rather than thousands, at a lower cost. These advances led to a rise in the number of newspapers published, with more available at prices affordable to the working class. By 1860, about 3,000 newspapers were published in the U.S. with a circulation of roughly 1.5 million, in comparison with about 500 newspapers with a circulation of about 3,000 in 1820. Papers were often read aloud in homes, bringing news of the government, politics, and local events. Significant speeches were sometimes printed in their entirety, giving politicians and social activists a much wider audience. Stories from one newspaper might be reprinted in others, sometimes with local commentary or editorial rebuttals added. The advent of the telegraph meant news from distant places could be disseminated much more rapidly. Newspapers also relied on news, factual or not, provided in the form of letters to the editor, which were usually unsigned or made use of a pseudonym such as Plato or a true American. In the 1830s, the penny papers led a revolution in journalism. They sold for a penny each, making news and even literacy itself more accessible to the working class. Many stories in the penny papers were sensationalist and embellished, to say the least. Modern tabloids can trace their origins to the penny press, but so can modern mainstream newspapers. As the papers grew in circulation, they increased in size from one sheet to 2 or more. To fill those pages, editors added reporters with specific beats. Although sensational stories sold a lot of papers, so did opinion pieces.